Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters, stories, and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Henry Bernstein.
I'm Brandon Bernstein. No relation.
We are super excited to bring you the full interview we had with Jerry Ordway from this past summer in July of 2021. You may recall we included some excerpts from the interview in our Nucleon episode, and we wanted to share the full conversation that we had with Ordster here. Enjoy. We are here as part of a podcast called Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, and we're looking for explicitly Jewish content in superhero comics. It's just an area we've always felt connected to and wanted to see that kind of representation there. And we've gone all the way through, and we're pretty now deep into the deep cuts of characters. And we discovered that Al Rothstein is canonically Jewish. Adam Smasher, aka Nucleon. How do you pronounce that, by the way?
We just always said Nucleon.
Nucleon. Oh, like a nuke.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Like the neutron, like Jimmy Neutron.
There we go. Okay,
oh
perfect.
My God, I would so watch that show. Albert Nucleon, Jimmy Nucleon. Either way, I'd watch it. Yeah.
That's great. And so we discovered he was Jewish, and we sort of accidentally discovered all this Jewish content about him. And we sort of identify explicitly Jewish content as characters identifying as Jewish, characters reading Hebrew or, in a Jewish prayer service or ritual, like a Jewish wedding or a bar mitzvah or something. So, or celebrating Hanukkah, like The Thing has done from time to time. So that's sort of the kind of thing we're looking for. And we were just delighted to see that Al Rothstein had all this stuff. And I was even more delighted to see that you, one of my favorite Superman and other creators, co-created him with Roy Thomas. The thing that was shocking most was, I don't know if you're aware of this, on Wikipedia, you're listed as Jewish. It specifically says Mr. Ordway is Jewish. And it's because you're included in a list of Jewish creators whose works would be given away at a panel put on by 2015 New York Comic Con, and the American Jewish Historical Society included you on this list. So any idea why you're listed as Jewish, Mr. Ordway?
No, I remember, for some reason, I remember somebody telling me that Howard Chaykin was talking about it. Maybe it was around that time. Like he said, "Oh, Ordway's a member of the tribe," and I was like, "What tribe?" I didn't understand what he was talking about. I don't know.
We have Howard Chaykin to
maybe. Well, he might have just been seeing what was like, if he saw the list of creators, maybe that's where it came from. But
well, for the few days that I thought you were a member of the tribe, I was very excited. So you're welcome back anytime.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did Howard induct you in a way and say honorarily you're a part of it now?
Yeah, he did a special whatever. He took me to temple.
Because that's what you do. You have to go to temple. Yeah,
I guess.
Right.
It was just funny. I mean, I don't really. I don't think I've ever even discussed much religion stuff, so I don't even know where that would come from. I mean, I'm honored to be part of the group.
Well, we're honored to have you.
Yeah, we're honored to have you. And also, I think one of the things that Henry and I wind up talking about a lot is just the importance, the language of today is of representation and how great it is to have Jewish characters represented. So, I mean, regardless, I think we're just both appreciative to have one more comic member of the tribe that you did co-create and did make.
Right.
And we found, I think in 1999, DC published this comic book / newsletter called Alter Ego #1, and there's a piece written by Roy Thomas that says it has your input on also, and it was going through all the characters in Infinity Inc. and the background and the creations. And so Roy Thomas acknowledges that Cyclotron, which is Nucleon's grandfather, right? This villain, that he'd been had been the grandfather of Albert Rothstein. And then it says, became the grandpa of Albert Rothstein, whom Dan and I named after science fiction comic fan and friend Alan Rothstein out in LA. We thought at high time comic books had an overtly Jewish superhero. Maybe we were the first with that bit. Maybe we weren't. We didn't know and we didn't much care. So great line, wonderful to have. And I think we were curious to know, were you a part of that process at all? Do you remember any like sort of behind the scenes conversations about the identities of Nucleon in particular, any of the other characters?
Just that it was part of his, I mean, we were given like I'm trying to remember how it worked. Mike Macklin and I were working on the art for Infinity Inc. We were also doing All-Star Squadron. So we had worked together on the character designs, and Roy would throw us a name, basically. He would throw out a name, and for some reason I remember Nucleon being, just because he was going to be kind of connected to the Atom, Roy thought it was probably kind of interesting to have him be the really tall guy instead of the Atom. In the comics, the 1940s Atom was a very short guy. So that I remember that, and I remember when we were doing the first issue that there was some biographical info in like flashback in the first issue of Infinity Inc. But we actually drew the characters first in All-Star Squadron because it was a time travel story, a way to introduce them. And that has the All-Star Squadron Annual #2, I think it was, has the origin of the Nucleon's mother. I think she's a baby in the story, and she's somehow very important to the resolution. And Cyclotron is kind of, as I recall, he was kind of like maybe a wayward good guy, who he was a bad guy in the storyline, but then he kind of redeems himself. But I remember that they were trying to protect this baby, and the baby, I think, is the character that then winds up being Nucleon's mother or something. Or yeah, I think that was how it worked. So the Cyclotron character was the grandfather, then his daughter would be the mother. It was, again, that was like more than 30, probably 30 years ago at least, right?
Yeah.
More than 30 or 40 years ago almost.
Yeah, still impressive. You're able to just pull all that back.
It was pre-crisis, right?
Yeah, it was. It would have been around 1983, possibly. And I think Infinity Inc. debuted in 84. But it could have been early 84 for them. I don't know. I mean, again, I just remember that storyline. I remember like when I was drawing when I was drawing the book, and drawing the character, that I tried to make each of the Infinity Inc. characters distinct, just because when you have a comic with a group of characters, they're not always in costume, and I always felt like they should be identifiable somehow, and you wouldn't want to have two blonde characters, and you know what I mean? It's like if they're out of costume, their comic characters kind of tend to be generic because you're limited with pen and ink. But I always tried to give them some basis, some kind of distinctive characteristic, and I remember with Nucleon was the crazy mohawk. He had like a mohawk. So hey, when he was out of costume, nobody really had any problem identifying him.
Right. Between the height and the mohawk, he just sort of like stands out. Yeah.
And the only Jew on the team. So,
and I think, I mean, I believe when Roy was writing the book, he probably added more from after I was on it for the first year, and then the story continued. And I think I do recall in reading those that he added more religious background to it. So it wasn't just like some kind of a stunt casting kind of thing or whatever. I mean, he did I think he tried to give it a little historical backdrop and a little, religious backdrop. But most of my knowledge of Jewish culture, I mean, my wife, her mother is Jewish. And I remembered, like the idea of, the various holidays and things like that. But Jerry Siegel, I know Jerry Siegel, I got to know him a little bit. And I don't think I ever knew anybody who was like strict, observant, Jew with the, not being able to, like, I think you weren't supposed to turn off a light, or you couldn't, you know what I mean? There was a
something like that
where you couldn't use an elevator, you had to use stairs. And I just
Yeah.
found that kind of fascinating, but I thought it was interesting that you know, your level of commitment is much more than me. I was raised Catholic, and our big thing was just that we couldn't eat meat on Friday, you know.
Yeah.
And then they
Yeah.
relaxed that
Yeah.
rule after a while. But when I was a kid, if you ate meat on Friday, you know, you were going to go to hell. You know,
Yeah.
there was
Gotta go hell. Yeah. We have
Right.
versions
I
of
have
that too.
vivid memories. I think in high school, one year during Passover, when you can't eat leavened products, so no bread. And I was hanging out with my best friend who was Catholic and his family's Catholic. And it happened
oh
to be a
no,
Friday, and we're trying to find a place to go. And we're like, well, there can't be any bread for Brandon, and there can't be any meat for the whole family. And so we're
right,
like,
right,
this was a time before there was a plethora of vegetarian options everywhere.
right, right.
Yeah.
Well, I have an interesting Lent
That's so
story
funny.
too. Not that it ties into your other stuff, but when I was a
Yeah.
kid, I went through. We had to go through confirmation, and then communion happened as the second stage. But confirmation, the communion was like a big deal, and I was fairly young. I remember being maybe 8 or 10 years old at the most, and I had we observed Lent. It was a very big thing because I was going through all that at the time, and I was, you know, like suddenly, oh, we can't have meat. Whatever you gave up, you had to give up your favorite thing. And at the time, this will date it if anybody wants to look this up on Internet Movie Database. But my favorite TV show was No Time for Sergeants, and it was only like, I think it only lasted a single season. But that was my favorite show, and I gave it up for Lent. So I thought that was like a big, you know, a big thing to give up, right? So my older brother got sick. He had a burst appendicitis, and he was in the hospital. So I would go with my mother to visit the hospital, children's hospital, but I couldn't go in to see him because he was, you know, fairly ill. So my mother would park me in the lobby where there was a TV, and I was supposed to sit there for whatever an hour or something, you know, and there's a nurse or somebody at a desk. So they were kind of supervising me. And the TV came on, and it was No Time for Sergeants. And I went, oh no. So I went up to the desk and I told the lady, I said, is it possible for you to change the channel? Because I gave up this show for Lent. And she said, well, a lot of people seem to enjoy it. I can't do that for you. So I turned around and I decided to go outside. This is like 9 o'clock at night or whatever. It was dark. I decided to go outside and walk around the block. Meanwhile, my mom comes down and she doesn't see me, and she thinks, you know, like, what happened to my darling little child? You know, one child's sick, the other one's been kidnapped. And I guess I only got away with it because of my good excuse. You know, she went outside, and I had just completed like maybe the first circle around the block, and she was like, "What are you doing out here?" I had to explain that. But I don't think anybody else can have that excuse that they gave up a TV show that nobody remembers.
It's still amazing. Like, I love that story. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's amazing.
That's amazing. You mentioned you mentioned Jerry Siegel, and that you got to know him a little bit. Or fairly well. Did he ever talk about being Jewish, or if that was a part of his life in any way, or because that was the first person that came to mind for you?
No, I got the sense that he was. I also got to. I think it's funny because I think when you see people at a comic convention or whatever, that's not the first thing they're going to talk about. But I got the sense that he was fairly religious, and I mean, I did. You know, again, while I was on Superman and that experience of meeting him and learning a little of the history, I didn't realize that a lot of the names of, you know, the Kryptonians, some of that came from Jewish culture as well, which was interesting. The other one.
Did he confirm that with you?
No, but I'd read, I had read interviews with him about that. And the other one that surprised me, again, this was like in the mid 80s, I got to know, or got to be friendly with Jack and Roz Kirby. And his work, I never really saw it until I was older, really, but his work was very religious, and he was drawing from a lot of, you know, sources like that. And I didn't really appreciate it until I think I was probably older, you know. I guess it works on different levels. It goes over your head. If you don't understand it, you just think, oh, that's a cool concept or whatever. But once you understand it, you go, wow, that's really interesting, because I never, again, at a comic convention, he's not going to sit down and tell you all about, religion or whatever. But I understand that he was a pretty, he and his wife were practicing, and they were, I don't know if they were strict, you know, probably in the sense of having, the Passovers and Seders and things like that. But he seemed like a spiritual guy, though. I mean, just when you talk to him, he had kind of there was a peace about him, even though you knew he was kind of a feisty, combative guy. He was just a really sweet person, but there was definitely he was something special about him. And I never really thought of how much he drew from religion for the concepts, because, as a kid, I read Thor, and Thor just was like Norse gods. It's like, how does that relate? But yet it all kind of ties together, because the histories and the stories go back so far. It's almost like a shared, there's a certain shared quality to a lot of the ancient religious stories. The stuff I heard when I was in church as a kid, and that was always probably the most interesting thing about being in church as a kid, was when the priest would tell a story from the Bible, because they felt kind of like bigger than life, even though there were life lesson kind of things. They always, they felt probably relatable to comics in a way, to me, to my childhood head, my brain. And then I truly believe that a lot of this stuff is historically accurate. I think it's just a matter of it being stories being told down by a verbal method, rather than, all of them being in words or whatever. A lot of stuff is retold, and but that stuff fascinates me. So, I mean, I don't feel as religious as I did as I was a kid, but I feel spiritual, and I still feel like the history of that intrigues me an awful lot.
Making the weird jump from like the ancient to sort of like some of the modern mysteries, if you don't mind, one of the questions we had, you might not know this at all, that's totally fine, but in that article there's a mention also of Alan Rothstein as opposed to the character Albert Rothstein. So Roy Thomas had mentioned him, and one of the issues that Henry and I are going to cover, we have a flashback to Nuklon's bar mitzvah, and there's a little note that says, special thanks to Alan Rothstein, bar mitzvah advisor. So clearly he's someone that Roy Thomas knew. And we were just curious, since you got to work with him on this, is this someone like, who was Alan Rothstein? Do you have any idea? Were you connected to him in any
I would
way?
imagine it was somebody that he knew in Los Angeles.
Okay.
I think he moved to, was it South Carolina or something, back in the later 80s, like, or early 90s. But when he was in Los Angeles, I think he was probably in a more social situation. He was also writing movie stuff, and I think he had, he and another writer, Jerry Conway, would write screenplays and treatments together. So I would imagine that their circle of, casual friends was probably fairly wide. But I think it's fascinating. I mean, one other thing that he did, and he and his wife Dan had done with Infinity Inc., was he had come up with an idea of how many characters there were going to be. And once we went back and forth to determine the lineup of the book, the core group, which was about 8 characters, he had or his wife and he, I don't know who was the genealogical, or not the horoscope person, but so they had horoscopes written for all the characters. So they basically, he must have, or she, between them, they must have determined birth dates, birth month, birth years for each of the characters. And then they had a reading done for each of them. And I always thought that was really fascinating, because as any writer working on a monthly comic, it's easy to run out of ideas. I mean, you're working on a monthly comic, and presumably if you have something that lasts longer than a year, you're always looking for fresh angles. And I always thought it was fascinating with the horoscope thing, was that if you took someone's horoscope and someone was a Sagittarius versus a Virgo or whatever, the character traits are different. And those character traits, if you were stuck as a writer, or if you were just like okay, which one of these characters would be impulsive and do this or this. It's like almost like a cheat sheet that you've created for yourself. I thought that was really fascinating, and it made me wonder, I guess even at the time, whether that was an offshoot of working in Hollywood, and because you hear about actors coming up with histories for their characters beyond what's even being performed, just so they have like a more fully realized sense of what a character is and how to play him or her.
Yeah. And I think like TV show writers have like a show Bible, right? Where there's sort of all
Yeah,
these
yeah,
details
yeah,
that might never make it onto the screen, but it's
yeah.
really important to know it in
But
the
then
writer's
at some
room.
point it might come into play. That's the
Yeah.
thing that's beautiful about having too much research or too much information like that, is you either, like when you're doing like a comic character, you can draw from your own life, you can draw from things you remember from your childhood or friends or what have you. But having something like that, I always thought was a really kind of fascinating way to approach it, because someone's horoscope born in 19 whatever year, so they would have, if they debuted in 84 and they were 20, so they could have been 1965, 64, whatever. Someone born in 64 under a certain sign is going to be slightly different than somebody born in 65 under the same sign, because of the star positions, and it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Did you have on that little cheat sheet for Nucleon, like El Rothstein, Jewish, like?
I wish I still had it. I was looking for it at one point a couple of years ago, because I wound up writing a 2-issue Infinity Inc. story for DC that Roy didn't want to do. And I was looking, that would come in really handy, and I couldn't find it.
Oh.
Of all the stuff, I saved so much paper, but I didn't save that. But I have such a vivid memory of it. And they're interestingly, the TV show Stargirl, excuse me, is returning for season 2 in the middle of August, I think. And they're introducing a couple Infinity Inc. characters, Jade and Obsidian, who were Green Lantern's children. And it made me wonder, since they seem to be building an Infinity Inc., whether they're going to introduce Nucleon, or, even without his secret identity, if Al will be in it.
Yeah, I mean, that would be awesome if he was. I know he's going to be in the new Black Adam movie.
Yeah.
Not played by a Jewish actor, but
I wasn't sure what I'm not sure. I don't think I've even seen what the actor looks like, but the movies are always so different that it's hard to feel disappointed one way or another, because it's not going to be what you're thinking it's going to be or whatever. It's almost like a guarantee to be disappointed before you even see it.
Is that a what you experience when you see one of your creations on screen, or is it like, oh my God, I can't believe something that I made is now in a movie or a TV show? Or somewhere in between?
Mostly thrilling. I mean, honestly, it's like, it feels, it's like nobody pulls up to the house and gives you a wheelbarrow full of money. It's not like that. It's more about like recognition and feeling like, oh, see, that character that I fought to create or co-create or whatever has some enduring quality that somebody found reason 30 years later to put it in a TV show, knowing that other people will recognize it. That's the key. They're not doing it because, oh, this is really obscure. They do it because they know there's fans out there who might be, in their 40s or 50s or 60s who remember it. And so it's like an added bonus or an extra added value or something. I mean, they used Nucleon in, or I don't know if they called him Atom Smasher in The Flash a couple seasons ago.
Yeah. And
I was kind of disappointed because it was only one, like the one episode. But the disappointing part in any of that type of scenario is that when it's a one episode, one type of thing, they're just going to do whatever the character's power, and you're not going to really get any kind of characterization because they're just one episode guest star.
Wasn't he played by WWE's The Edge? For
I don't remember.
I think so. I think
Adam
so.
Copeland, The Edge.
Yeah, I think he played
That's funny.
him. Yeah.
I just remember that they had like a kind of a stock CGI thing where they were making characters really gigantic, and it felt like, oh, he doesn't really have to be like 15 feet tall,
Yeah.
which is funny.
Right.
I'm curious actually, since you mentioned about like you don't really get a chance to delve into who they are as a character from your own perspective as the co-creator, like how would you define the character of Atom Smasher? Like what is that character? Who is he to you?
Well, when I remember at the time when Mike and I were doing the art, it was to me, again, I would always try to be like a method actor as an artist. So I would try to find ways to have the characters have some kind of distinctive thing. Like they would either pose themselves in a certain way or, like with Nucleon, I always felt like he was a little bit awkward. And he was, there were other characters like Hector Hall was the son of Hawkman and Hawkwoman. And he was the perfect, chiseled blonde Adonis character who was very confident because he came from this, kind of confident setting. Parents were archaeologists, and a lot of parents and characters were archaeologists in the old comics. But anyways,
apparently you're not the only one who had an obsession with archaeology, huh?
So he was like the jock. He was the confident jock. He had the beautiful girlfriend who's Wonder Woman, Earth 2 Wonder Woman, and Steve Trevor's daughter. And she's basically, an Amazonian or half Amazonian. So it's like, there's your king and queen of the prom. Al was the kind of tall, kind of gangly guy who, before he had his powers, he was like 7 feet tall. So he was somebody that I could kind of relate to, because when I was a kid, I had a growth spurt from freshman year to, sophomore year in high school. And I went from like 5'9" to 6'2". And I just remember that feeling, I remember the feeling of being the small freshman and then suddenly being the feeling of being tall, but I was also incredibly skinny and, I just felt that. So that I always felt like that was an aspect to him that would play into his personality as well. Like he was the guy who was probably looking for the team. He was looking for friends in that sense. He was looking for that. Whereas these other couple characters were definitely like the leaders, no preordained. They were going to be the ones that whatever they say, you go there, sure, you're going to do it. So that's how I always assumed. I mean, he felt like that. His backstory was also that, as I recall, he was raised by his mother, not with a father. And I mean, that was my situation as well. So when you're drawing these things, you do, you try to put a little of yourself. So I think I probably empathized more and felt more of him in that situation. The only downside there is that, again, working on just the first year of the book, I think Roy got into more of the character stuff that I would have loved to have done in the first year. He did more of that later on, and it always kind of annoyed me, because if he had done that in the first year, I think I would have been happier and I would have stayed with it. But instead, I was a little disappointed. It was one of those projects that I had great hopes for, and it didn't feel distinctive enough in the first year. I just felt like it was this same basic story we did in All-Star Squadron. It was just that it was now set in the 80s, and DC, everybody was doing at the time, like DC had the Teen Titans, and the Teen Titans at that time, they were doing great, really interesting stuff with characterization. They could take the Robin character and turn him into Nightwing, but they could take Robin and give him an alien girlfriend, but they dealt with it in a somewhat more realistic way. And there was a little more angst, and there was a little more, human emotion involved. It wasn't just, oh, let's go fight the bad guys or whatever. So, and that always appealed to me. And I think that's kind of what I found as an approach, a way into doing Superman, was to try to do him as the man and not as the Superman. Everything is filtered through his earthly parents' wisdom and his experience on Earth, as opposed to another way. I mean, that's with most characters. I feel like that's that's what you would, if you read about a superhero, that's the part that you could feel familiar with, you know. But anyways, that was, and again, one of the things that I was thinking about too, and trying to think of something to talk about on your show. One of the things that as I grew up in the 60s, but 70s, I was becoming a teenager, and 70s and 80s were very formative. And I always think back to how important, there's certain TV things that I remember really vividly. And one of them was Holocaust. That was like Meryl Streep or something. It was a mini series. But the other one was Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which were big, you know, and they were all about the rise of Nazism and you know, I don't know, besides the killing of the Jews, it was actually displacing them and putting them in places they, you know, like weren't before or whatever. And that stuff, I remember that bringing me to tears as a teen, you know, because I really didn't have any of that historical background. I mean, we learned probably more about World War II watching combat on TV than we did in school. You know, it was like, oh, the good guys won, and that's kind of where the story ended. So I was fascinated by that. So when I started doing All-Star Squadron, and you know, it was set in 1942, it basically fostered that love of history, especially that time period. Just being fascinated by how somebody or some race is, you know, labeled as a problem, and how transparent it is now as an adult, like looking at that and seeing how these things are always done for a political purpose. You know, I mean, it's like, it's like terrible things happen to people, to races of people or religions of people, based on someone choosing them to be the good boogeyman, you know?
Yeah.
And it's just crazy.
Well, yeah. for those, you know, people that you mentioned, minorities, marginalized people in general, how do you approach bringing minority cultures and identities that weren't necessarily your own, as you mentioned, into the comics that you created?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I mean, I don't think I'm any saint about it, but I've always been I've tried to be conscious of not being dismissive, and to try to be, I guess you'd say, inclusive. I mean, I always try to, like when I was doing, whenever I had an opportunity to do it, like when I was writing stuff, you know, I could do things that are different than you can do when you're just drawing a script, or even if you're working from a plot and you're adding things. Like when I worked with Roy did some, again, very progressive stuff he introduced Amazing Man, and he kind of used a little bit of the Olympic stuff from Jesse Owens, you know, in that character. He kind of baked some of that in there, and I always thought that was great. And I felt like that was a way to address, in a way, I mean, it's funny to address a 1940s thing where, yeah, in the 1940s you didn't see Black characters except as waiters or, you know, maids or something like that. The same as you didn't see Asian characters except as, you know, villains, or as, you know, house servants or something like that. So I think that was like a really clever way of putting a little diversity into something that was set in the 40s. But I've seen, again, you go to comic shows, and that's, I mean, the best part of that experience is talking to people and meeting people. And over the 40 years I've been doing it, that still is the most fun, you know, to find out, even when people don't agree with what you say or whatever, I'm happy to talk to anybody. You know what I mean? I'll argue with you if I think you're wrong or whatever. I'm not just going to go get away. I think you have to at least give an opportunity to try to talk to people. But anyways, what I've noticed is there's like a whole generation at this point of kids who are, maybe some of them in comics, who thought like Amazing Man was the most amazing thing, because wow, there's a Black character in this 1940s thing, and I've seen in a different way. Like I have our first child was a daughter, my daughter Rachel, and when she was little, I would take her to comic conventions. This was during the late '90s, and you would see like all the stripperella type characters at the comic shows, and that was the only female type representation. There really wasn't any character in the comic at that time outside of Archie comics that you could see her seeing something positive. You know what I mean? Like she's Catwoman with her high heels and her, sexy poses or whatever. That's not what you're going to want. She's not going to want to read that, but it embarrasses you as a dad to realize that all the female characters are basically pinup poses, right?
Right.
So I've always tried to steer clear of that. Like when I was doing Shazam, Mary Marvel, she was an equal character. I always tried to treat her in a positive way and not as just a visual way. And again, a lot of that stuff goes against the grain because the comic industry's always been predominantly male. And you see it through your kids' eyes that an industry is not welcoming to a girl audience. That was like a major revelation. I was kind of amazed by that. But yeah, I see it with meeting kids, and you see like recently within the last 5, maybe 10 years, maybe 5-10 years, DC has introduced a Muslim Green Lantern character or whatever. And I do see people reflecting that, and it's like, oh look, now we have a comic I can show, and look there, here's a character like you, and he's a superhero or she's a superhero or something. So I think that's really positive. I think that's the type of thing you can do as a comic book person, because no one from the top down is going to say you must do this. I mean, they may be doing it. I don't know if they do that now. Maybe it's possible, but at the time, most of the more, again, they're not really progressive, but I guess you'd say progressive things. You would do them because, like, when I was doing Superman, I go, wow, every character in this book is white. There's no, characters of color. There's no characters anything different than what existed in the 50s. So Mike Macklin and I created Gangbuster, who is a Hispanic character. And, we basically, when I was writing the book and when Byrne was writing it and we were co-plotting, we got Gangbuster to the point where he was dating Lois Lane seriously, and it was never an issue of like, oh my God, Lois Lane and a Hispanic, that never occurred to any of us as a thing, like, oh, we're trying to force this down anybody's throat or whatever. But that's how it happens. I mean, that's what you do. You do it because you look and you go, wow, this is all the same, and Kirby did it in the 60s. I think Kirby probably more so than Stan Lee, because I believe Black Panther, for example, came out of his sketchbook. I think that that stuff was important then because it sets some sort of precedent and it becomes important. Like you're saying, you don't think about it, but like Nucleon L. I mean, how many other characters are visibly Jewish within comics, which is an industry that was founded by Jews?
Yeah, that's sort of our whole mission / premise, like looking at people like Siegel and Schuster, Kirby, as you mentioned, Lee, and like where are the characters that would have reflected their actual experience. I mean, when you asked how many, not many. We're nearing the end, we think, but we've
do you know the story about? I mean, you might. You probably do know. Do you know who Gene Luen Yang is, the writer?
Yes, for Smashes the Clan, Superman Smashes the Clan.
Well, he did it. Yeah, and that's a great book. He did this really interesting thing, which I only heard of because my daughter's a big fan of his writing, and she kind of got me to read some of this stuff. That not the Superman, but before that. And he did a thing. He worked on a thing called the Green Turtle or something. And apparently, this was like a 1940s character. But the kind of cute part and the interesting part about this character was that the artist, I guess the creator of the character, was an Asian, maybe Chinese, I think he was, but he couldn't make, I mean, he wanted to make the character Chinese, but they were like, there was resistance to it. So he kind of covertly made the character Chinese. Like he always avoided drawing the face, apparently, and he did all these things, but the character is clearly Chinese. So when I think Gene had had found this character again through some research or whatever, and he did new adventures of the character, establishing him as, you know, the first Chinese or Asian superhero. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
So cool.
But again, it's a case of the artist in this case probably trying to kind of get around whatever company policy or the writer's idea, and putting a lot of his own ideas and maybe bits of culture that he knew into baking them into the character without being overt, because he couldn't be overt, you know. And the comic book type coloring, it's not like, you know, in the 40s or whatever, they made Asians yellow. That's not a realistic skin color. So, you know what I mean? There's no, if you were an Asian and you looked at this comic book, you could go, hey, that's like me. You know what I mean? It's not a stereotype. Yeah, I don't get to see his face, but I see these little things drawn in the background that clearly, you know, are cultural or whatever. So I think that's kind of cool. I mean, it's a cool way of kind of subverting someone else's intent in a way, and getting your, you know, your ideas in there, whether, you know, whether somebody's aware of them or not.
Yeah. Speaking of sort of ideas people might not be aware of, like moving back a little bit. So, you know, you were asking us about how many other Jewish characters there are. Our first character we covered was the Thing, right? From Fantastic
Right.
Four. Obviously, there was lots of evidence that we found, including a famous holiday card Jack Kirby made of the Thing being Jewish well before he ever appeared as Jewish in the comics, right? We didn't see it till 2002 when Carl Kiesel sort of wrote a story where he's Jewish, but like we knew he was Jewish from before. So since you had mentioned also sort of these like, you know, the star charts and all these things that are in the background, we were just curious, is it pretty common to have that kind of like aspects of characters' identity, whether it be like this one's actually Jewish, this one's actually Muslim? Were those kind of things known among creators, even if you weren't allowed to show it in the pages? Is that something that would like?
I think some creators would, you know, could telegraph their intent.
Okay.
I know that when I don't think one of the big problems, and again, this is, I'm not complaining about it, I'm just saying, like, here's how it works. You create a character for Marvel or DC, like DC allowed something called character equity, which means that if they made a toy or they made a movie or a TV show with Nuclon, Roy Thomas, Mike Macklin, and I would get like, we would split 10% of whatever DC's licensing fee that they would get for it. So we would get money for it. That doesn't mean we control the character. It doesn't mean that we have any control once we're not doing the character physically. So some other creator can take it and do different things with it, as is the case with Obsidian from Infinity Inc. I think in the Manhunter comic in the early 2000s is, I think, the first where they said Obsidian is a gay character, you know, and it's not like, I mean, I remember reading it and being kind of shocked because I'd never really thought of it in those terms. I mean, I honestly don't think I thought beyond whatever gender norm it was in my head, male, female kind of thing, just because that was not my experience. You know, I don't think I had any gay friends until I got into comics, and I met a few people that, you know, so I didn't really have that even in the back of my head as something. So as much as I wanted to try to put in a black person into a Superman comic, I wasn't thinking on that level, because for the most part, comics were always non-sexual. I don't know how, you know what I'm saying? Like, I grew up in the 60s. It was all about, you know, oh, Peter Parker, can I pay my rent? Can I save Aunt May by getting her pills? You know, am I going to be able to afford college tuition? It wasn't so much of a romance thing, because again, they were probably targeted to, you know, prepubescent boys.
Right. It's sort of like how the Wayne Boring Superman is like completely sexless. Like you're just like, yes, Lois, I'm your boyfriend, you know, but they're not hooking up or anything.
He was built like a water heater. I mean, he was just like, there was no angles on him. But it actually, one popped into my head that, which kind of directly addresses what you'd asked about characters having a subtext that's not necessarily known. When I was working on Superman, John Byrne had created Maggie Sawyer, who was she worked for the Metropolis, you know, special crimes unit or whatever. And he flat out told me one day when we were having lunch, he said, "Oh, I just created a character, and she's gay, but it's never going to be said. It's only going to be implied." And he said, "It won't need to be," and I understand it's like you don't wear your heart on your sleeve, you don't, project your whatever, your whole life to strangers type of thing, I think is where he was coming from. So he had Maggie Sawyer, and then he would show her at home, and there was another woman living in her in her apartment. So it was like, okay, we get it, we understand. But that's the only one I could think of that was actually built in.
Did you ever have to push for, you said, earlier you said this character that we fought for, talking generally about characters, did you ever have to push for these kind of extra backstory things, whether it's sexuality, religion, ethnicity, and did you ever get pushed back from DC or your editor or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, you never, I mean, we always, I think we and me, plural and, singular, you always try to throw something interesting, and it doesn't always land, and that's the best way to put it. When we were pitching Gangbuster, we got a lot of resistance from Marv Wolfman because of various reasons. I mean, we wanted, Mike Macklin and I really wanted to use the Guardian because we're big fans of the Jack Kirby Fourth World and his Jimmy Olsen comic where he had the Guardian Newsboy Legion, in present day at that time.
Talking like they're from the 1920s.
Right. But we really wanted to use Guardian, and we were told by the editor that we couldn't use any Kirby characters because they were going to introduce them at a different point. I guess it turned out it was in the Superman annual or something that Roger Stern wound up introducing, like the Cadmus Project, and I think he did do the Guardian in that Superman annual. So we were kind of like, okay, well, Superman needs something, and our point of it, again, Mike only lasted one issue on Superman, and that he had to quit because the writing was really slow and the deadlines got crazy, like right off the bat. So anyways, but when we were still hyped about it, the idea was to do Superman. Superman was always a little bit, to me, I felt like Superman as a character was kind of boring. And that's why I think Clark Kent was the interesting way in. But even as a super powered guy, he's way above, above a lot of people's classes as far as the abilities and stuff. And what we wanted to do, and I specifically wanted to do, was I wanted to have a contrast between the poor neighborhood, which was Suicide Slum, and Metropolis General, like where the Daily Planet was. It's kind of like the difference between Manhattan and, at the time, the Bowery or Hell's Kitchen or something. And we felt like Superman patrols the skies there, and maybe he can cover everything, but he's not at ground level necessarily. He's fighting some superpowered guy up in the sky or over the ocean or whatever. So the idea of Gangbuster really was an attempt to show that there weren't all, upwardly mobile white collar workers. There's neighborhoods here where these are people who are struggling and where there are problems that reflected things beyond Superman's reach, because there were social problems that maybe he couldn't step into because there's a mayor and there's a city council and there's, structures that he's not able to or wouldn't upset. So
is it that he wouldn't upset them, or he wasn't sort of aware of them? Like,
no, he was. I think the feeling was like, my feeling always was that the character, he could take over. He could empty the White House and take over. He could empty the United Nations. He could rule, but that's not him. You know what I mean? He's the most powerful guy around. So if you're the most powerful guy around, you have to be very careful. And that was always in the back of my mind. You can't ever allow anybody to fear you. In other words, that's why he was very positive. Beloved. He took care of the bad guys, but he didn't really terrorize anybody. He wasn't Batman because he was so powerful that if people had a sense of fear, they would go, wait, this guy could rip my arm off, or this guy could incinerate half of us. So in my brain, that was always a no-go. So Superman followed the rules. He would do what he could within the framework, but he was not able to solve everybody's problem, you know, and nor would he, because he believed in people governing themselves and all that, you know. And that was always in the, again, it's stupid, but the few things that you come up with when you're trying to figure a way into a character, those are important ones for me. They always were, because it's like, well, why does he exist? Why is he different? You know, why does Captain Marvel smile a lot? Because Captain Marvel is a little kid who thinks it's great to be an adult, you know, that type of thing. So that was my way in with Superman. So Suicide Slum exists, and he can help, and he often did help in those books, but he was fighting to save 10 million people versus here's what's going on the street. Gangbuster could save 3 people, or he could help a family, or he could, you know what I mean? His help was more along the lines of what Batman would do, you know? And that was what we wanted. We wanted that contrast. And it felt like the reason I wanted him to be Hispanic was because where I grew up, when I was my mom had a tavern in a neighborhood that went from Polish and German to Hispanic over the course of, you know, I mean, when I was in school, it was predominantly Hispanic and Puerto Rican, and I fit in, and they were all my friends. It wasn't like it was adversarial in any way. And my best friend was Frank Flores, and we had plenty of Rodriguez and Hernandez and they were all my friends. So I felt like when I was doing this, it's like, yeah, there really aren't any Hispanic characters. You know, I mean, at that time, DC had Black Lightning. They were doing Black Goliath. They were trying something, but it was like, it feels like there should be Hispanic characters too, you know? So Gangbuster, Jose Delgado had to somehow be that. And I did feel like that was a little bit of an uphill battle, but that got easier. I mean, I just started drawing him in, you know? I mean, I kind of forced the issue. Like, yeah, we're going to use him, you know?
That's amazing. I'm a huge fan of Jose Delgado. I love him. I wish they would bring him back. And
again,
maybe,
though, I mean, you know, I don't understand why. It's like all the characters that I contributed, side characters to Superman, Bibbo's another one. Those are characters based on, my mom had her tavern, and her tavern catered, because we were both, my older brother Mike was already in college. He's 16 years older. So I always remember him being off in school. But my brother Joel and I were a couple of years apart, and my mom raising us by herself, she worked the tavern. We lived in the back. So she kind of worked at home kind of thing, you know? So all these people became family, and she had the tavern open during the day. She opened at 8 in the morning, closed at 8 at night. And most of the clientele, with the exception of after work, she had guys from the machine shop who came in, but the guys who were there all day, and women, were all old, you know, retired people who had no place to go. So they just sat and they socialized and they nursed the beer all day. And they were all real funny characters. You know, they were all, I guess they seemed like something out of The Thin Man, or, you know, like a Damon Runyon story or something. They all had interesting backgrounds, which I found out as I was older, not when I was little, but all that stuff, you know, eventually winds up in the Superman comics with Bibbo and the Ace of Clubs and stuff. And, you know, it becomes comedy relief to a degree, but that was my family when I was a kid, you know, and Bibbo was a real guy. He was an old guy who worked on the docks, and he, you know, clearly was an alcoholic, but he was a super nice guy. And he used to walk my brother and me to my grandmother's house when we were little. And, you know, he was like our watchdog, our guardian. Just a beautiful, beautiful old guy who was tough as nails. You know, I saw him when I was about 10 years old, I guess 10 or 11. He was rapping on the front window of the tavern on a Sunday when my mom was closed, and my mom wouldn't answer it because he was really drunk and he wanted, you know, something to drink. So one of the other neighbors called the police, and what they called a paddy wagon showed up with about 6 cops who tried really hard to take this guy down. This guy was drunk practically off of his feet, right? He's swinging. These guys are hitting him in the head with billy clubs. It was horrifying for me as a kid because this was our friend, right? But he wouldn't stop either. He hated cops. It was, it was like a Popeye fight, except for the fact of hearing a billy club, with that echo on his skull. But we were able to, my mom was able to go out there and step between the cops and say, stop, stop. And they just put the cuffs on him and took him to jail, and we wound up bailing him out, But it was just, like little things like that's the life experience stuff that you kind of carry with you you make what you make of it. I mean, it didn't happen to me, but, we certainly witnessed a lot of violence in that neighborhood, and yet we still had a fun, decent childhood,
Where did you grow up?
In Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Oh, so you're a Midwesterner.
Yeah.
You're just a neighbor of mine.
South Side, Milwaukee.
Yeah.
We were right across. I don't know if you know Milwaukee at all. If you ever.
I do.
We're right across
well.
we were right on the 5th Street Viaduct, South Side. We went downtown. The big bridge over the Milwaukee River. It's kind of like almost like
I love the Pabst is my favorite theater.
Which one? The Pabst? Yeah.
The Pabst. Yeah.
Well, that's the cool thing about that history in that area, is that the Milwaukee River. I mean, they built the 6th Street, and then 6th Street, and then 25th Street Viaduct, 26th Street, whatever. They built the viaducts to go over the Industrial Valley as a way for cars to avoid having to deal with stuff. And they were going over rivers and stuff too. But, the smell of pollution was always fairly strong as a kid. But we used to walk that 6th Street Viaduct. We'd go across to downtown, and that's where we got our comics down on, I think it was like 4th and Wisconsin, right across from Woolworths. There was a newsstand, and that newsstand, a friend of mine who's still in Wisconsin had sent me a little thing, I guess a nostalgic thing with pictures of the guys who ran the newsstand.
What were you getting in those days? What were you collecting in the 60s?
All Marvels, Fantastic Four, Daredevil, Tales of Suspense with Captain America and Iron Man and Spider-Man.
Do you still have them?
All those guys. I wasn't a big Kirby fan really until he went to DC, as I think God knows why. I love the Fantastic Four now, but at the time I wasn't like a huge Fantastic Four fan. I loved Captain America when he drew him. I loved that stuff. But I remember the Fourth World stuff was just mind blowing. And I guess I would have been like 13 or something maybe when that debuted. So maybe the right age to feel like I was being sophisticated.
Yeah, perfect time.
Yeah. And it gets back to that sort of mythology that you described liking, right? The sort of like Fourth World really builds into that. Jack Kirby got done sort of building in other religions and basically created his own.
Oh yeah.
So,
well,
yeah.
I mean, do you think that? I think the New God stuff certainly feels more Jewish inspired than the Thor stuff because of some of the naming characters.
Yeah, Highfather sort of feels
he
that
had the
way.
source wall, and he had he had the swap of that concept felt, again, maybe that's just an old world kind of thing, but it felt like there was a lot of weight to the entire story because of the fact that you had Orion, who was, Darkseid's son, being raised by these more pacifistic, genteel gods, and poor Scott Free is, just run through the gauntlet or whatever on in Armageddon or whatever. Like it felt really just super compelling to me at that age, and again, you're probably right that mythology aspect, I think it probably hit home to me more powerfully than the Norse stuff, because the Norse stuff wasn't really delved into as much in Thor as, there was mostly Earth adventures, and then, the palace intrigue was happening in the, 4 pages in an issue, and the rest of it was him fighting, the Absorbing Man or something.
Yeah, it wasn't really to Walter Simonson that it really dove into the Norse mythology in a really cool way.
I think that was the big change there. But yeah, the New God stuff just had it all right from the beginning. I mean, the idea that even like in the Jimmy Olsen stuff, the implication that there's some evil mastermind, and you find out his dark side, is behind these moves on Metropolis and Earth and the anti-life equation. I mean, those are all very exotic. Like that anti-life equation is such an exotic sounding concept, and nobody's, I guess to my taste, it's a type of thing that really can't be described and can't be, once you think you've understood it, it loses the whatever mystery and aura it has. It's like I guess whatever the opening the box to find out if the cat is dead or alive.
Yeah, Schrodinger's box.
Schrodinger's cat.
There's more power. There's more power to it as a name, as a concept. It's bad, but once you define what it is, it's easy to go, oh, that's all. He just wants to. He wants to imprint humanity or whatever. It feels like, it should have almost an open-ended thing that it can be whatever you think would be the worst thing, as opposed to, I might think something different than you might, that somebody else might think something different. What's your biggest horror? That's what it is, But to my brain at that age, it was just very exotic and very, it just sounded scary and cool. And I've had so much empathy for Orion because he would lose it and he would become more animalistic, almost Jekyll Hyde kind of thing. Which, every kid went through that, where you'd do something that disappointed your parents, and then, it was like out of character, and that made it even worse, but so there was a lot of stuff as a kid that I really empathized and felt. It's interesting to think in those terms, because Kirby found ways to include, a black god, and when you see the movies, like when Thor debuted, you had, I'm sure there were people who were going, well, that's not the Asgard from the comics, but in essence, they're all concepts, and as much as we all probably have a certain glory days time of reading comics or liking a certain character or whatever, this is the best it's going to be. The concepts themselves are like very malleable, and I mean, to me, it feels like the most important thing to have those characters. Superman, any of those characters should be relevant to the current audience that's reading them. I mean, they can't be like trapped in amber. I think that's probably the worst thing, that could happen. You just lose a thread, or even if you lose a generation of readers, you've broken a thread that's existed for 80 years in a lot of these cases,
Yeah, and I think that's one of our favorite ways to compare comic books to Judaism, because in so many ways we kind of think of Jewish ritual also as like needing to respond to the issues of today, and each new generation gets to discover it anew and play with it and pass it on. And I think, you were talking earlier about sort of people who are very deep in their practice, and Henry and I are both from, I think a more progressive branch of Judaism, when we're really like, we're interested in keeping this thing alive, not necessarily doing it the way that it was done exactly 200 years ago or 500 years ago. So really fun to just hear that description and to sort of reaffirm that, like, we see in comic books in a lot of ways what we see in Judaism, and that's why we love bringing it together. I think what we'd love.
That's probably, I was gonna say that's probably true, even though you think of things as, being inflexible to a degree. I always felt like, even though I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore, I still, it's almost like, and this is going to sound really bad, but I think of it as like, I still like the Milwaukee Bucks and I still like the Milwaukee Brewers. I don't go to games anymore.
They're your
but
team.
I'm still interested in. So in a way, I always find it interesting to read papal updates and what the new, any given new pope has as what to say, or how he's going to change something, whatever. So I feel like that's the funny thing. Whenever anybody tries to put any of the religions I know much about, when they try to put them in a box, I think that's always wrong thinking, in the same way that you imagine everybody maintains their car to the degree that the manual says, or that they do, you know what I mean? It's like there's always flexibility, and people always you know, slide a little bit here or there on stuff, but they still maintain their, you know, they're still able to walk the straight path.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. I think we'd love to, if you don't mind, wrap it up with just some quick, hopefully like rapid fire questions to start bringing it
Sure.
to a close. Yeah.
If I can give
I got
rapid
some
fire answers.
I got some rapid fire ones. Okay. So how do you pronounce Wonder Woman's mother's name?
I used to say Hippolyta, but I've heard Hippolyta too.
Hippolyta. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
both.
So we on our podcast we've had various like discussions about certain pronunciations. So that sort of, I thought Hippolyta, but Brandon thought Hippolyta. So I guess we're back to where we were.
I only say it because I think in Infinity Inc., Wonder Woman's daughter is Lyta Trevor. And I always thought, well, if it's Lyta Trevor, would it be Hippolyta? I always thought of Hippolyta though. So that feels more,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know if that's more Greek or which that is.
Whatever. Okay. Carl Kessel or Carl Kiesel?
I do know that.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you. We had this argument. It was a friendly argument. In our first episode, because he's the one who canonically made the thing Jewish. So thank you for clearing that up.
I'm trying to remember, when was that Kirby drawing of the thing with the did he have like the
yarmulke?
The yarmulke on in a, it probably appeared first in like a Jack Kirby collector or something. That's my feeling. And I think Carl, I'm not trying to speak for him, but I think that actually doing that story where he is, you know, officially a Jew or whatever, kind of sprung out of that. I think I've seen that drawing, because nobody had seen that drawing really, except maybe Mark Evanier and people close to the family or whatever. So I think when that showed up, that's my feeling, my gut feeling. And he felt like, you know, Carl is that type of guy. He's very thoughtful. He's a very thoughtful writer too. But just personally, he's a very genial, thoughtful person. Not the type of person who, I mean, I think I'm prone to sometimes being a little nasty to some people, not all often, but he's like super, super even and mellow. And I think he puts a lot of thought into stuff like that.
What are you working on now? Anything you'd like to plug?
I'm like doing a lot of covers, but I'm also working. I actually spent most of my downtime. I've been doing like a self-published comic that I sell at comic shows, and I also have a link for on my Ordster's Random Thoughts on Google Blogs. But it's a character of mine from, I created him when it was probably in 1974, and I've been trying to do stories. I guess the third one I did 12 pages over the last year and a half of Proton stories. So that was my goal. I just kept trying to say, turning other work down and doing commissions, but trying to work on stuff, because I had these stories, and I still have these stories in my head. And I just, you know, I don't get the opportunity to do much writing. Nobody calls me from Marvel or DC. So I feel like, you know, it's the only way to get to exercise that muscle. You know, the writing stuff has always been fun for me. I mean, you can't shut ideas down. You always have them. And so I've been trying to, instead of saying, gee, I wish I had time I've been trying to make time to do some of my own stuff. And it's satisfying when you know, I mean, as much as I can't believe it took me a year and a half to do 12 pages, at the same time, it's like, wow, I did 12 pages. So
yeah.
I'm willing to look at the positive.
How do folks find you for commissions?
I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm at Jerry Ordway, I guess. How does it work? Jerry Ordway at twitter.com.
Yeah.
But my handles
are
just like
just
capital
Jerry
J,
Ordway.
capital O, but it's, yeah. So you can find
I would
there.
say you're a must follow. I would classify you as that.
I try to balance. I try to put up artwork, and if I find interesting stories, I retweet them. Like today's New York Times had a story on James Gunn about his transition from going to Suicide Squad from Guardians of the Galaxy and being fired, and that was really interesting. I figure comic fans, if they're reading it, they might not see that story, if they see it, I think they'll enjoy it. And sometimes I recently, in the last 4 years, I've probably tweeted more politics than I ever had before that, because I just couldn't be quiet any longer. I just had a hard time. I went into this thinking I don't want to be political, but I just have been so horrified that, I just couldn't be quiet. I thought, there's a point where if I'm going to lose a couple people, I'm not trying to preach to you. I'm just trying to show you examples, and hopefully you will learn from some of these.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm like pinching myself. I can't believe I'm talking to you. I mean, truly, Jerry, Mr. Ordway, you and Dan Jurgens are like when I close my eyes and I think of Superman, I picture your Superman.
Well, we're the guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was good talking to you. I mean, I like the idea of not. I mean, honestly, sometimes I get so many requests to do podcast stuff, and a lot of people just want you to either rehash stuff or, I mean, I'm a talker anyway, so I can fill the space, but it's kind of dull to have to do the same exact thing over and over. So I'm happy to talk about just different stuff, or grab it out of the air.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Again, we can't thank you enough, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you very much. It was fun.
It was really fun. It was
definitely
really
send me a link though when you get your thing put together.
We will, for sure.
Okay, it was good talking to you guys. Thank you.
Good talking to you. Take care.
Good night.
You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Jewish Comics Pod, or you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com.